Today we're going to talk a little bit more about Brad's new book, The Pattern of Progress. And it's exciting because the audio version of the book is now available as well. So that's another channel of access to it for anyone who's interested. And so we're going to be talking a little bit more about Brad's book. I think it's also worth having a conversation, probably the first of several, about transportation, given that there are some, there's movement in that domain right now. There are rumors. We'll see. We've heard rumors before, but there are rumors that a certain company is going to be starting a quite exciting certain new service, Robo-taxi service, autonomous electric vehicles providing transportation as a service, mobility on demand in Austin, Texas, sometime relatively soon. Again, it's the company I'm talking about, of course, is Tesla, and we have heard rumors and we've heard exciting and optimistic predictions and timelines before from that particular company, but we'll see. Hopefully, fingers crossed, this is finally the moment, sometime later this month, or fairly soon at any rate, when that service will go live. And we will see the realization of another instance of what the RethinkX founders, Tony Seba and James Arbib, analyzed and predicted in their landmark work about the disruption of transportation going back a decade or so. So those are the things that we're going to talk about today. But let's kick it off with, at least initially, some discussion around your new book, Brad. Why don't you just tell us how it's going, and a little bit about the audiobook and what the process behind that was, because this is something that's new and that people may not be familiar with yet.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with it either, but we published the book through Kindle Direct Publishing. So this is a digital form that you can download and read on your phone, read on your tablet. There's also the print version, so you can have it printed out and sent to you. And then people started. We published those, and people started requesting an audiobook. And said, will there be an audiobook? And I was really concerned about that because the book is very sort of data driven, visually driven. I have something like 140 figures, graphs and figures, more or less. I don't remember the exact number, but and so how are you going to have an audiobook when you have a lot of visual content, a lot of quantitative information, and then as well just the act of reading it. The act of reading this book is 164,000 words. So we made the audiobook is done now. It's 20 hours long. It's a 20-hour recording basically, but I didn't record my own voice. I thought sitting there and just reading, this will take days, weeks. By the time you edit everything together, I don't really know if people want to sit there and listen to my voice specifically. It's nice sometimes with famous authors to hear their voice. So I know that you went through this process for your book, Brighter.
Painful process.
Yeah, painful. It's just, and hearing the process that you went through of having to record and then edit and get everything into an audio file. And when we published the Pattern of Progress books, Amazon has this feature. So it's on Amazon. It's also on Apple Books. But on Amazon, it has this feature that said your book is eligible for an automatic audiobook or something like that. And I was like, well, what's that? That sounds better than having to sit down and record it. And it's just a matter of, text to speech. So I know that there's some very realistic sounding, text to speech now with some of these AI companies have, voices that sound very fluid and natural and whatever. And I listened to their sample on Amazon, and it's still a bit robotic. It's not, painful to listen to, but it's also not, some of these super smooth, very cool new audio features either. So it's, it's a little bit robotic, but that can also be nice because it has, sort of a rhythm to it, and it doesn't sound like a person. It just sounds like a computer generated voice. And I pushed the button that said, yes, please make an audiobook. And of course, you have to listen to the whole audiobook and make certain that it's pronouncing everything correctly. It does make some mistakes. So, it mixes up the word lead and lead. So, if you're talking about the metal lead and something's in a lead container, it'll say it's in a lead container, and you have to correct it and say, no, that's no, whatever. It's a computer, trying to do its best with the fact that English isn't regular. It's not pronounced always the way that things are spelled, but it was very good with some things, some chemical names, some place names, whatever else. It got them perfectly, and I was sort of surprised by how well it did, on some obscure words, and how poorly it did on some others. But I listened to it all. I corrected it the best that I could. Again, there was the problem of this being a very sort of visual book with graphs and charts and things. So I put in sort of alt text descriptions, if you will. I realized, some people are visually impaired, and even if they had the print version or the digital version, they wouldn't be able to see it. And some people just prefer to listen to an audio description. So put in the alt text so that when it gets to a figure, it does, as best of a description as I could write of what the figure looked like. So that way, I'm hoping that people aren't missing too much, from listening to the audio version as opposed to the print version. And I realize, and then Amazon as well allows you to buy both, so you get a lower price on the audiobook if you already have a print version, a digital or print version. And I realize that some people want to listen when they commute or whatever. 20 hours you have to have quite a long commute, or I don't know, if you've got a long trip planned this summer or something, you're going to drive across Asia or something. 20 hours. I don't know.
20 hours is a long drive. Yeah.
It's a long book, but it's not priced any higher than other books. So I think you're getting like twice the content. You're effectively getting 2 books of content for the price of one. And I'm hoping that people enjoy it, and I've gotten good feedback so far on the book itself. The sales have been okay. I was number 1 in Amazon's technology category for like a day. I saw that little alert pop up.
That's great. Congratulations.
I guess Amazon, you can always divide something into a small enough category and you'll be number 1 in something, number 1 in books written by people.
Well, technology is a pretty big category, though.
But it was number 1 in technology for a day, and I'm still, up there. So some sales, will push it back up, get more visibility, kick off this sort of self-reinforcing feedback loop of the higher you get up on lists, the more sales, the higher you up on the list.
Right.
And considering that the book,
that's how it works.
And the book deals a lot with self-reinforcing feedback loops. How the more you make of something, the cheaper it gets, the more people buy it, the cheaper it gets, because of economies of scale, because of rates law. So it's
it's interesting. I mean, the book is also about, obviously, the pattern of progress involves disruption of existing and incumbent products that are based on older technologies. And it's interesting. I mean, audiobooks themselves are almost certainly destined to be a short-lived product category that is ripe for disruption now. We talked a little bit about that before this conversation, but it's the old-fashioned way of producing an audiobook was the way that I did it ages and ages ago, back last year, and of course the year or 2 before that for my nonfiction book. But I've done 2 books. I did one, the novel, and then also a nonfiction book. And those have to be read a little bit differently because one is emotive, obviously, and the other less so. But now AI narration, AI text to speech with all of that nuance, that's all possible now. The leading edge, the cutting edge, the leading labs, the leading service providers in this domain are producing absolutely astonishingly high quality text to speech results. Things that sound completely natural and completely fluid, even with content that's emotionally charged and so on. And so the one could imagine, yes, you could produce an audio book that was AI generated, AI narrated, and then you could have features like, well, I want to listen to it in this voice, or I want to listen to it in that voice, and I prefer a British accent, or no, I prefer an Australian accent, and so forth. So one could imagine these different options being layered onto the basic product that we've known for many decades now, an audio recording of a book's content. But again, that's likely to be only very, very briefly sensible because, possible today technically, almost certainly a commonplace within a couple of years, is going to just be having an AI assistant that you carry around with you read the digital version of the book in any way that you want it read to you. So why would you buy a separate audiobook if you could have the digital version of any book and your personal AI assistant that lives on your device anyway can see the digital version when you open it, flip through the pages for you, narrate it in whatever voice, in whatever accent that you please. And then if it runs into something like, okay, well, here's a chart or a graph that's in this nonfiction book like Brad's, there's 140 of them in the Pattern of Progress. Not only would it be able to give you some version of alt text, it could literally explain, okay, Brad, here's here's what this chart is showing. And you could have a conversation with your AI assistant. No, well, I don't get that. Are you sure? Let's go through that again. Can you explain exactly what it's showing? I'm a little confused here. And of course, this is much more like having a companion reader alongside you. Well, AI, that's where AI is headed. Like I said, technically, that's probably possible right now. Certainly, it will become commonplace shortly. And in that context, audiobooks as their own product make not that much sense. So this is itself an example of, a disruption produces a new product segment that gets filled and then very quickly becomes itself target for disruption. And so you have, the one technology has an S curve, and then very quickly it has a collapse curve as the new S curve ticks over, and you've got overlapping X curves there, to use the terminology that of our team and that's in your book. And so audiobooks and audio recordings in general are going to be a space to watch for those disruptions over the next several years, for sure.
Yeah, there's a great tool by Google called NotebookLM, and I love it. So it's an AI system, and it was developed by Stephen B. Johnson, who's an author who writes about, science history and things like that. He's written a book called Emergence. He's written one called The Ghost Map. He has a whole stack of books, and they're just great sort of history, technology, science kinds of books. And he's been working with Google to develop this system. I think it's intended primarily for authors like himself, but it's just a great tool as a result, which is that you can, it has this folder structure system, and you can put documents into a folder, and they can be quite large. I think you can have 50 documents per folder, and they can be hundreds of thousands of words. I think it's 500,000. It could be 200,000. I don't remember exactly, but you can effectively put in millions of words of sources into a folder in PDF documents. It's a Google product, so you can put in YouTube video addresses, and it will automatically take the transcript from those and that sort of stuff. And then you can ask it questions. And right now it's a text-based system. They have a couple of other, so you just type in a question and you get an answer back in the form of a paragraph like you'd get with ChatGPT. But there are some other tools. There's like a mind map tool, so you can see a book sort of split up by these branches that then branch off of all the main concepts in the book, and then the sub-concepts, and then the sub-concepts of the sub-concepts, and so forth. They have this tool that creates automatic podcasts that sounds like two people talking, but it's all AI generated, but it's very realistic voices of people talking about the sources that you upload. So I've put in things that I've written, like a copy of my own book, and they will create a podcast of many minutes long, 10 minutes or more, of two people talking to each other about the subject. So they're not reading word for word. It's AI sort of digesting the material and coming up with its own kind of insights and perspective. And now there's support for multiple languages too, so it's not just English, but you can read text in one language and get this audio in another. But I've just found this tool very helpful for sort of looking through documents, asking it questions. And as I said, right now it's text-based, but I could easily imagine, the next level is they have it be a conversational AI, where you could sit there with headphones on and talk to an AI about your favorite books that you've uploaded and marked as ones that are of interest to you, and it will be an expert, your friend who's an expert on these 5 books that you've uploaded, and it's only interested and knowledgeable about those things. So instead of just listening to an audiobook word for word of what the author intended to say, you could be listening to sort of a new speech about, based on these 4 or 5 books, here's a new perspective on things that are in some of them but not in other ones, or that kind of stuff, to help you brainstorm, to help you think of your own ideas. But I found that tool very, very helpful, the Google NotebookLM, just as a way for my own research, and just also for sort of digesting other people's work.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, again, I mean, with the time frames the time horizons are so short here. We're literally talking about just, a few years at most. The idea of books itself could become quite antiquated. It's likely they will continue to be produced. Certainly, human beings are likely to continue to produce books for some time. I think that is a a fairly realistic and reasonable assumption. People will continue to write books. But I think it's also very clear that as AI capabilities increase, we approach artificial general intelligence, move quickly into artificial superintelligence, that a book is something you're simply going to be able to ask for from the AI that you're using about any topic that you please, and it will be able to. A book on a given subject will be something that can be rendered out, that can be generated in real time upon request, on demand, as opposed to having the the long, arduous, painstaking process that human beings have to go through to write, whether it's a nonfiction book or a fiction book. I mean, the fastest that I've ever heard of people producing, books that are actually of a reasonable quality that are marketable historically without the assistance of automation in any sense is probably Isaac Asimov. I think he's probably the most prolific author I've ever heard of. There may be, I mean, surely there are other examples that are extraordinary as well. But Isaac Asimov, famed science fiction author, was a bit of a polymath as well. So he didn't just write science fiction, he was a scholar as well. But he was notoriously prolific in his career, which was a long career. I mean, a number of decades, 40, 50 years, something like that, maybe longer. He authored and edited 500 and something books. So something on the order of 10 books a year or more. It's just an astonishingly rapid, prolific rate of production. But nevertheless, that's still, a month or more to write a book. Astonishingly fast by any normal human standards, but glacial compared to, the 60 seconds or 90 seconds or 120 seconds it's going to take for, a generative AI to produce a new book on demand in 2026, 2027, 2028. If that capability is not literally already possible now at the press of a button, it will be very shortly. And the V1 versions of this won't be the highest quality. You're not going to necessarily get Shakespeare, but within a few years you will, and then a few years after that it'll all be superhuman and higher quality than any human being could hope to produce. Again, just instantly on demand. So books themselves are very likely to be disrupted, along with everything else in life by AGI and ASI in fairly short order. So this is going to be a very anachronistic conversation to look back on a few short years from now.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, that's how I start out my book, is by talking about self-reinforcing feedback loops, because like I was saying earlier, you sell more of something, it gets cheaper, so you sell more of it. But this, we see these self-reinforcing feedback loops all over the place when it comes to, like you were talking about, artificial intelligence, where we're using software and computers to design computer chips. The computer chips, the next generation's faster, so it makes it more powerful software and better design of the next generation of computer chips. And Moore's law, whatever, we've been seeing doubling of transistors for decades now. So better software, better hardware, better software. And we're just seeing, these self-reinforcing feedback loops in energy as well. Solar power getting cheaper, lithium-ion batteries getting cheaper. Lithium-ion batteries, we talk about, RethinkX talks about opening up new possibility spaces. They started off as laptop and digital camera batteries when they were introduced in the early 90s. Then they started powering cars. Now they're using them for grid applications for energy. They get cheaper. Cars are getting cheaper. We're seeing Chinese cars coming out that are very affordable by Western standards, but also good quality for the price. This is the core that is making Tesla's Robotaxi potentially be a very cheap vehicle, and therefore high profitability sustainability potentially. And so yeah, it's these self-reinforcing feedback loops of something gets cheaper, it gets more popular, something gets more powerful, so it makes it easier to produce the next generation of the same sort of hardware. And we've seen it in all sort of aspects of life: information, communications, energy, materials, and transportation now. And they're all interacting on top of that. So, cheaper, like I said, cheaper information and communications made energy cheaper, made transportation cheaper, and they're all interacting with each other. So it's just faster and faster over time, and that's what happens with self-reinforcing feedback loops. It's the same dynamics that create pandemics. It's the same dynamics that create nuclear explosions. More of something leads to even more of something, leads to population explosions, leads to economic growth. So that's why we've seen, centuries of this exponential economic growth. And will it continue, or will it give way at some point? Either something breaks or we break through to some next level of human performance. And yeah, it's all driven by the same sort of underlying basic dynamics of self-reinforcing.
Well, let's look at the historical example of automobiles. I mean, you talk about the disruption of horses by automobiles in your book, of course. It's a well-known example. Tony Seba, one of our co-founders, quite famously popularized this. He's got the iconic, picture of the Easter parade in New York City, 13 years apart, and in the first image, it's all horses in one car. And I believe that's in 1900, and then in 1913, same location basically in New York City, and it's all cars and one horse-drawn carriage. Mm-hmm. And so the transformation happened very rapidly. This has now been copied, widely. Many people are using this example. So, but let's talk a little bit about that, because there are multiple overlapping and interacting feedback loops there as well. One of the ones that's fun to think about, of course, you discuss this in your book, is you sort of have a twin flywheel phenomena where the new technology is being spun up because of a variety of feedback loops, and the old one is being spun down and collapsing as a variety of feedback loops are at work. Some of those feedbacks involve governance, supporting institutions, infrastructure, investment, those sorts of dynamics as well. So in the case of automobiles, maybe you could talk us through a few of those things. In your book, for example, you mention that in 1900, when automobiles were brand new and they were the disruptive technology, there weren't pre-existing traffic lights. There weren't even rules of the road. There weren't filling stations. There were things like watering troughs for horses as infrastructure, which automobiles obviously didn't need. And so maybe you can walk us through a little bit of the feedback loops that were operative there, as well as a new platform emerges and network effects take hold, and public support waxes and wanes for the new versus the old, and so forth. Because these are all part of the pattern. Irrespective of the technology, we see the pattern again and again and again.
Yeah, so obviously there were sort of hardware interactions, like I mentioned, with computers, faster computer chips leading to better software and better designs of the next generation of computer chips. And we saw that with cars as well. So, when cars first started to become popular, very early 1900s, 1905, 1910, there weren't many paved roads. So we had a lot of dirt roads, and there were funny old videos that you can watch of, cars bouncing down these dirt roads that are just in terrible conditions because we didn't have, asphalt roads. And where did asphalt roads come from? Well, the oil industry was growing up as cars got popular. We started using fuel. And when you refine crude oil into gasoline, part of what's left over is the heavier aspects, the heavies, so that like asphalt. So, okay, we've got the heavy components of crude oil. We'll use that to pave the roads. What's left over for making the gasoline now becomes road surface. So that was part of it. But there's also, like you said, the laws and mindsets and shifts and whatever else. So the sort of softer aspects where the sort of key technological innovation, if you will, that unlocked paved roads was the idea of a gasoline tax. So, somebody has to pay for the roads. How are you going to get this whole network, literally network sort of infrastructure spread throughout a city? We have to have some way to pay for it. Oregon invents the idea, or has the first gasoline tax. Every time you buy a certain amount of gasoline, a small portion of the money goes to fund the roads. And very quickly, we get a wide network of roads throughout the centers of major cities, which makes it easier to drive in those parts. And then later on, we get the interstate highway system in the 1950s, basically, again, over about a 15-year period. But this all comes back. This is sort of hardware, but it's also the software, if you will, the laws and that sort of infrastructure. And we see that, it's not just a matter of law, it's things like trialability of new products. So some people might want to adopt a product, hear about it, think it's cool, but not really buy one until they see a friend of theirs use it. If your neighbor has solar panels on their roof, maybe you say, well, okay, I didn't realize it made sense in our area, but maybe it does. If my neighbor did the work of investigating this, then I can piggyback on their work and then just ask them, hey, where did you get those solar panels from? And who did you? And it said, oh, it was easy. You talk to this company and they come out and they do an assessment and you sign a form and whatever else, and you'll have to pay for it, but you're going to make your money back. When you said, oh, I didn't realize, how quickly this would happen. But somebody else has done the work for you, making it easier for the next person. We see the same sort of network effects in, the adoption of the telephone, the adoption of the internet, where if your friends have telephones, you want one too, because now there are people you can call. If your friends are using the internet and they have email addresses, you want to sign up too, and so that you can get an email address and you can contact each other. So these sort of network effects, trialability issues, anything like that, the word of mouth, spread advertising. So, any sort of network like that, there's often this sort of initial hump that you have to get over. You want some critical mass of people built up in an area. You need enough car owners in downtown for the city to start thinking about paving the roads. But when they do, then it makes it easier for other people. They say, okay, I'm going to buy a car now that we actually have decent roads in this area. So yeah, it's not just about hardware and technology. It's sort of social, the more the laws, the mindset, and then sometimes new inventions will help to drive new industries as well. So when Henry Ford started making his cars, nobody was growing. There were no plantations of rubber trees. Nobody was growing rubber. We were producing rubber from wild harvesting of trees. I don't really go into this so much in the book, but we were wild harvesting trees, and the very first plantations for rubber plantations came about because of the rise of the car industry. So, sometimes a new invention will cause, changes upstream in steel production or how glass is produced or how rubber is produced. So yeah, again, these are all self-reinforcing feedback loops that help to drive a new industry growing, and then they work the opposite way for causing the old industry to unravel. If you're the only person who has the beta VCR, and you go to the rental store to rent a Betamax tape, and everybody else has VHS, and the VHS section is huge, and they said, sorry, we don't have Betamax or Sony Betamax format, then you have to go and get yourself a VHS format VCR. Otherwise, you can't watch movies. So these network effects and also cause the old system to unravel quickly too. If Uber starts to lose riders, starts to lose drivers, if their business goes down, even in just one area, it doesn't have to be nationwide or worldwide, but just in one area. And if drivers aren't making enough money picking up passengers, then they'll stop driving. They'll say it's not worth it. And if there are fewer drivers, you have to wait longer for your Uber to arrive, then people will say, I don't want to use Uber anymore. So these same sort of self-reinforcing feedback loops can be at work in the opposite direction too. They're both virtuous cycles and vicious cycles, depending on whether you're the incumbent or the disruptor, and whether you want to see the number go up or see the number go down. And but yeah, it's the same sort of underlying mechanics either way.
Yeah, well, we're going to see some of this play out specifically in the transportation sector as transportation as a service emerges as a new business model. Tony Seba predicted this more than 10 years ago in his book, Clean Disruption. He anticipated this. He did a full analysis 3 years later in 2017, I believe, with James Arbib. That was RethinkX. It was RethinkX's first major sector disruption report, the disruption of transportation. For the purposes of the analysis in that original 2017 report from RethinkX, the assumption was a takeoff occurring in 2021. It was just the assumption for the purposes of the scenario. It looks like that takeoff maybe was more like 2024, or certainly now into 2025, with Waymo offering services and some other smaller service providers. Cruise was in the market for a while, but it now looks like Tesla is going to enter the transportation as a service market in force. It's been coming for a long time. But the point of the original research the emphasis was not on, it was often misunderstood. The emphasis wasn't so much that it was, robo-taxis are going to be here on this date and then, it's X, Y, Z. That wasn't the purpose. That misses the point of the insights of the analysis and the modeling. The point was that the pattern is something we've seen before and we're likely to see again. And so from whenever the ignition occurs, whenever takeoff occurs, from that point onward, it isn't going to be a 50-year slow, linear, incremental changeover from combustion engine vehicles that you have to drive yourself to electric vehicles that are autonomous, providing transportation as a service. Instead, it's going to be something that unfolds, the bulk of it will unfold over the course of just 10 years. And because we've seen this pattern before, the bulk of the S-curve, the center of the S-curve, happens over the course of a decade or so. And from a very small percentage of market share, 5-10%, to the overwhelming majority of market share, 80+%, that we see this number, 13 years. We see that come up over and over and over again. It's part of the pattern of progress that you show in the book. And this is something that has occurred for, disparate technologies very, very different from one another. Not just digital ones in the modern era, not just whiz-bang sort of inventions and innovations, but technologies of all different kinds across many different sectors and throughout human history. And so that is the pattern to expect here. And a little bit later this month, a major entrant into that space, Tesla, is likely to be a strong sign if the technology does perform as anticipated. Is likely to signal that takeoff point has indeed arrived, that the technology has reached ignition, and we're about to launch up that S-curve that we have seen so many times before. So again, it isn't so much about pinpointing the exact moment of takeoff. The point is that once takeoff occurs, the trajectory is something that anybody who would claim the onus, I should say it this way, the onus is on anyone who would claim that this time will be special and unique and different, and this particular technology disruption won't occur swiftly over just a decade or so, but will instead deviate from what we've seen hundreds and hundreds of times before throughout history, and will proceed much more slowly or something like that because of some special circumstances or something. And so anybody who is unless you have very, 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 compelling reasons, very compelling evidence to say why the disruption of transportation is going to take 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years this time, and not follow the pattern we've seen so often before. You'd have to have extraordinary evidence to make a believable argument in that sense. And so that onus is absolutely on anybody who would make that claim. If you haven't thought through it and you're just assuming it's going to, this is something that's going to take many decades, as many observers, casual observers do, then you're in for a real rude awakening here. This is everything, all the signs are there, all the indications are there that this is likely to be a textbook case of disruption. Follow the pattern of progress that we've seen so many times before. X-curve is absolutely what to expect. And so, yes, it looks like we're a few years later than perhaps it looked like 10 years ago, but now the ignition point looks like it's arrived, and now we're going to see some big changes in pretty short order. At least if history's anything to go by.
I think so. I think that it's certainly what it feels like. So like you said earlier, Tony shows off the two photographs, New York City, 1900 and 1913. But what you don't see in still photographs are the vehicles moving. And obviously, cars move faster and further and longer in a month and a year than a horse will, a horse and a carriage. So if you have a little town and there's one horse and one car, that's a 50-50 market share. There's one horse and one car. But if the car is going, 6 or 8 times as much per month or per year as the horse, then the car is doing most of the traveling. So you can't just look at the hardware. You have to look at the behavior
Right.
of the actions. We take far more photos today than we did 30 years ago, or whatever. Any aspect of something that has gotten cheaper and easier, we do more of it. The basic economics. So when the car, with the car, Tony shows off those 2 photographs. But he also shows off a graph that shows the percentage of vehicle miles or vehicle kilometers, so vehicle distance traveled by cars. So we know how many cars there were registered in the US per year. We know how many horses there were, and we know for other countries too. We've looked at this for the UK, we've looked at it for Canada and other parts of the world. So we know how many, but for the US, we know, how many cars, how many horses, and how far cars were traveling, and about, you can estimate how far horses were traveling. And cars really did go from about 10% of all vehicle distance traveled to 80% in about a 13-year period. So this isn't just Tony, cherry picking 2 photographs from New York City that look nice to try to convince you that this is true. This is just basic analysis of the number of cars and number of horses and therefore the distance that they've traveled. And if you have, if what I've heard about Tesla vehicles, of how cheap they are to produce, and I've seen one myself. I went and saw one of these cyber cabs in person, and it was on display at a Tesla dealer, so it wasn't moving or anything. But it looks like, a very simple, sort of very plain design that Tesla does. It's battery powered, like all Tesla vehicles are. There didn't seem to be anything very fancy about it. So if they are producing these things at low cost, and they're traveling however many hours a day, I mean, it can be 8, 10, it could be 20. It's just whatever time it's not charging, basically, it could be driving. And if it's picking up customers in that time, earning revenue, taking people around, then we could each one of these vehicles is effectively multiple human-driven, sort of individually owned vehicles. So it's not just when you have just literally a handful of these vehicles out there, it could take over the ride-hailing market first. It takes over the whole taxi market shortly after that, and then people are abandoning their vehicles. Basically, you could still retain ownership. You could keep your car in your garage and just use it less often when you can call a taxi by an app. So you don't have to completely stop using your car. You can switch over, and that could be the next step of this. And we could very quickly see a shift. And 13 years, it seems like a reasonable estimate. And that was from data from 100 years ago, from the horse, horse to the car. It could be even faster today. And the numbers that I've seen for Waymo competing with Uber and Lyft already in the ride-hailing market, just in the handful of locations where they're operating. This can spread, to big cities throughout the U.S., then medium and smaller ones, spread around the world, and driven entirely by economics, by just the fact that these things are cheaper, they're easier to deal with than a human-driven taxi. You call them by an app. You don't have a driver to worry about. Everything I've seen from people using self-driving Waymo says that they generally prefer them because you're alone, and people are willing to pay more for them than a regular taxi or a regular ride-hailing ride. But if they're cheaper and cheaper to operate, this could be yet another disruption that happens very quickly, and plays out over just a few years. And I don't see what stops it. If I don't see what could stop it, just because of these self-reinforcing feedback loops that cause the new system to grow, and the same sort of vicious cycles that cause the old one to fall apart. I think we could see a very rapid transition, and it's already started with Waymo, and we're on the cusp of it starting with Tesla, and who knows how quickly it will play out. But yeah, it looks unstoppable, and it looks like it's starting soon.
Well, so there's lots more to say here about the transportation disruption that's imminent now. So this is probably a good place to wrap up for today, but we'll pick up this topic of the disruption of transportation in our next video, maybe several videos, because there's a lot more to dive into here.
Trucks, ferries,
It's
airplanes.
yes, exactly. It's more than just automobiles. It's more than just taxis. It's delivery. It's other modes of transportation. There of course, are first order and second order and higher order implications. In other words, knock-on effects, domino effects from when transportation as a service from electric autonomous vehicles starts to disrupt private vehicle ownership, especially of combustion engine vehicles. All sorts of things that change there. The way cities are laid out, parking stops making, parking structures, parking spaces stop making as much sense. So there's tons and tons of content to go into there, some of which RethinkX has published on before, and then some of which is new material. So let's circle back to this in our future conversation. But for today, we'll wrap it up and just point out that, again, this is all part of the pattern of progress. This is all part of the same dynamics we've seen over and over again. Brad has a fantastic new book out that digs a deep dive into the history behind all of that, with dozens and dozens and dozens of cases explored in depth in that book. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. So check that out if you haven't already. It's newly available as an audiobook as well, which we talked about earlier. So if that's your jam, then that new format is available now. Check it out. We'll talk more about the pattern of progress as we go forward as well. So with that, I guess we'll wrap it up, and we'll see everybody next time. Thanks for joining us, and take care.
Okay, thank you.